This is where it gets political. You may want to leave.
You steered that broadcasting bill through the House of Commons, didn't you?
Yes, I did indeed.
Oh, that speech you made about deregularising broadcasting. Oh, I cheered for you that night, Mr. Bennett. We must strive to offer the consumer a far greater range of choice. For too long, broadcasting has been in the grip of a small elite. We must expand and offer more choice.
Good heavens. You've remembered it word for word.
Well, it was masterly stuff, Mr. Bennett. I mean, oh my God.
What?
Your cutlery.
Oh, what's wrong?
A silver knife and fork. I can't believe it.
They're rather nice. I mean, they're not dirty, are they?
Oh, this should happen to you of all people. I am so sorry. I'll be right back. I do apologize.
Apologise for what? I mean, the fork and knife were fine.
Oh, it's very kind of you, sir, but I absolutely insist.
What? What's this?
Your cutlery, sir.
Cutlery? But these are plastic coffee stirrers.
Yes, I know, but at least you've got the choice now, haven't you? I mean, they may be complete crap, but at least you've got the choice, haven't you? Not so important, isn't it? But the choice! You mad, distracted bastard! What are you doing to our television system? What are you doing to our country? I gotta tell you! You bastard!
The Broadcasting Act 1990 is one of the most significant pieces of legislation in British broadcasting history. It was part of the Thatcher administration's wave of deregulations and privatisations that left almost nothing in the private sector by the time the Conservative Party finally left government. At the height of the neoliberal economic revolution, they actually found a way to privatise a private company. The IBA was effectively abolished, although somehow the organisation itself survived on the books until 2003. Its duties and powers, however, were transferred to a new body, the ITC. Well, some of them. The point was deregulation, remember, so the ITC were explicitly a hands-off sort of organisation. In the previous system, the IBA, and before that the ITA, were considered to be the actual broadcaster, with the franchisees working under licence to them. After the Broadcasting Act, it was turned on its head. The companies were broadcasters in their own right, and the ITC merely an oversight authority who generally let them get away with murder, which was easier now because there were fewer rules. From 1994, there was no longer anything wrong with one company operating multiple franchises, or franchisees buying each other out. There was initially a maximum of 3, until another Broadcasting Act in 1996 cleared the deck still further. Some protesters made a mockery of the whole concept, especially once it became the case that one company could end up owning every franchise, making the whole ITV network redundant. That's the free market for you. The ITC's first duty was to oversee a franchise round, but one like no other. This was one of the most radical changes made by the Broadcasting Act. Instead of the old job interview method by which interested parties could present a bid to the IT or IBA for assessment, and the one they judged best would win the contract, 1991 would be formatted as a straight auction, a blind auction, where companies and consortia, including the incumbents, simply put up a cash bid for the ITC's eyes only, and the winner was simply whoever's bid was highest. Nothing else was to be taken into account. No other basis was used. Purely and simply a money race. This was obviously a terrible idea, and the existing ITV companies immediately protested until they got a couple of safeguards from the ITC. A quality threshold would be in place, although it was never publicly defined. This threshold would be the first hurdle considered before money even entered the picture and the sealed envelopes were even opened. Ostensibly this would keep out anyone with more money than sound programming ideas. Also, as a final hurdle, there would be careful scrutiny of each bidder's business plan to make sure their bids, which were prospective annual stipends, were actually viable, i.e. the companies could still make programming without going bankrupt. ITV was never more up for grabs than this. Having said that, 3 regions went unopposed, although as a blind auction this wasn't revealed until after the process was complete, so Border were probably kicking themselves at bidding 52 grand a year, while Scottish got away with just 2 grand. Jammiest of the lot, the Central, who in what might have seemed like a bit of a reckless gamble, also bid just 2 grand for the relatively lucrative Midlands region. But they turned out unopposed as well. Part of the reason they managed this was that over the past several years they'd commissioned plenty of programmes from just about every independent producer in the region, disincentivising them from bidding against them and potentially ending a good deal. The only company that did consider looking its gift horse in the mouth was Mentor, young, hungry and big enough to roll the dice, but Central promised them a 2-year first look contract and they agreed not to bother. Not there anyway. You might have expected Channel TV to be on that list as well, but they actually had a challenger in the CI3 consortium. A lot of bids had the number 3 in them because the Broadcasting Act had officially christened the network for business purposes as Channel 3. CI3 was essentially the Jersey-based FM broadcasters Normandy Sound sticking their necks out, and although they actually bid higher than Channel themselves, 10 grand to Channel's 1 grand, they failed the quality test and Channel survived. Similarly, Ulster Television, who between the ongoing guerrilla civil war and the low population density probably didn't think of themselves as in that much potential trouble, found themselves inches from going out of business, with 2 consortia, Lagan Television and TVNI, emerging from nowhere and both outbidding them. Fortunately for the UTV, that turned out to be irrelevant because both challengers were failed. Lagan on quality grounds before the envelopes were even opened, and TVNI on their 10-year business plan. Another company who one might have expected to go unchallenged were Grampian. Grampian themselves certainly did, bidding a reasonable but modest £720,000 a year. And then suddenly 2 challengers showed up, both of which sported former Grampian continuity announcers on the board. And Dogood actually led North of Scotland Television, whose main promise was more coverage of sports such as angling and hiking, and an ultra-modern news service with satellites and everything, headed by the brother of the Shadow Trade and Industry Secretary. Since that was Gordon Brown, the connection would have been more impressive a few years later. The other Judas was Jack McLaughlin, although he wasn't the chairman of the consortium calling itself C3 Caledonia. That was Tommy McPherson, one of the most decorated soldiers in the British Army turned businessman, with stints at Brook Bond and Scottish Mutual Assurance, and the Coal Board. They also had Donny Munro of Runrig. Their plans seemed to largely involve coverage of business and industry, plus more programmes for old people. At crunch time, it transpired that Grampian, like Ulster, had been outbid by both its competitors. C3 Caledonia had bid 1.3 million, while North of Scotland had put up 2.7 million. However, both of them failed the quality hurdle, so Grampian retained their franchise by the skin of their teeth, or more accurately by that delicious word, default. One of the less secure companies was HTV, abbreviated from Harlech. They faced 3 bidders for their dual region, mostly Welsh related. Rather confusingly, there was one called Channel 3 Wales and West, and one called C3W, presumably with what the W stood for varying depending on the sub-region, had they got on screen. Channel 3 Wales and West, who quickly went with W3W as a potential on-screen identity because it was so much less confusing, are destined to remain mysterious. No idea who was involved with them. CW3 was sponsored by Flex Tech and United Artists, so they definitely had muscle. Also there was Merlin Television, which was a partnership between Chrysalis Group and Associated Newspapers, two media empires who made multiple attempts at entering the ITV network at this auction. HTV ultimately won out as the highest bidder, albeit just barely, outbidding Merlin by less than $1 million. C3W were well down in 4th place, while Channel 3 Wales fell at the quality hurdle. The open nature of the contest also enticed, once again, David Frost. Failing miserably twice in exactly the same way and to a near apocalyptic extent both times, apparently wasn't enough to put him off. Third time lucky, I suppose. This time he was partnered up with Chrysalis Group, yes them again, and no less than Richard Branson and his Virgin Empire, hence the name CPV-TV. Chrysalis, Paradigm, which was David Frost's company and middle name, and Virgin. CPV was Frost's most ambitious gambit yet. Remember how the rules have been changed so one company could own multiple franchises? Not many consortia had the resources to take advantage of that, but between Frost, Chrysalis and Branson, CPV could bid for the then maximum of 3. London, Anglia and TVS were all in their sights, with the grand plan being to eventually merge the 3 into one single service for the entire bottom right hand side of Britain. A truly monstrous vision, I trust you'll agree. It was not to come to pass. Although they were actually the highest bidder in London, CPV were pretty comprehensively outbid in the east and the south, and at any rate failed the quality check in all 3 places, disqualifying them outright. And so Frost tasted defeat for the first and only time. Although given how the previous 2 attempts went, he probably should have just been glad the band-aid was ripped off quickly this time around. He wasn't.
I remember that when I was at school, I was always told that the important thing is not the winning, but it's the taking part. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now.
Anglia, for what it's worth, were also challenged by a consortium calling itself 3 East Group, backed by the Daily Telegraph, but outbid them 17 million to 14 million to retain the franchise. The other 2 regions had other problems. TVS had served the South and South East reasonably well and produced plenty of worthy programming for the national network. Unfortunately, they had also fallen for the yuppie era, hook, line and sinker, with dreams of starting a global television empire from Maidstone. They tried to gain a foothold in America by buying MTM Enterprises, the company founded by Mary Tyler Moore that was behind some of the biggest hits of the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, they bought the company in 1988, just in time for its 2 mega hits, Hill Street Blues and St Elsewhere, to end. And they weren't going to make much on Eisenhower and Lutz, or Tattingers, even if they did know what they were doing, which they didn't. MTM had cost 190 million quid, which TVS had partly raised by the downright Shakespearean method of tearing off strips of metaphorical flesh from the company and selling them off to the likes of Canal Plus, making TBS a many-headed hydra whose heads were constantly banging into each other. The timing was also bad for reasons that went beyond MTM themselves. There was a colossal writers' strike going on for one thing. Although it finally ended a month after the deal was completed, it took the industry a long time to recover. Just to give you an idea of how bad it was, Star Trek The Next Generation's second series was 8 episodes long and ended with a clip show. Talking of Star Trek, the US syndication market was also tittering on the brink of collapse, unless you happen to have those 2 words in your name. And then at the same time, TVS invested in the ITV-related cable station Super Channel, which turned out to be another money pit. Within 2 years, they were trying to sell off 49% of MTM to stem the losses. And then the franchise round loomed on the horizon, which finally set the board into a panic over their jobs that culminated in the ousting of Chairman James Catwood for, by all accounts, keeping his head over the situation, which was interpreted as showing insufficient resolve. He did seem to have a plan though. Whatever it was irrelevant now, but it was probably better than what the remaining board went with. The extreme allure of the region hadn't diminished. If anything, it was richer than ever. So once again, it was the most bidded for region. There was CPTV, of course, who fell at the quality hurdle, but there was also Carlton Communications, headed by Michael Green, who wanted to be part of RGB so bad you could smell it off him. He tried to buy Thames in 1985, was told to sod off, and invested in Central instead. He and Carlton still owned a fifth of the Midlands franchisee, and after the Broadcasting Act, that couldn't stop him from bidding elsewhere. Green and Carlton put up a little over 18 million for the South and South East franchise, which, as it turned out, was nowhere near enough. But that was okay, this was just his backup plan. The South wasn't his main target. The other bid was from a consortium called Meridian. The television experience came from Select TV Productions. Nothing to do with the American cable company, these guys were behind some pretty popular programming, including Boone, Lovejoy, and various Marks and Graham productions. The money came from Mills and Allen, who were behind the majority of advertising billboards in the country. I mean, someone must own these things, right? Well, at that time it was them. Oh, and also, there was Central. Yep. The extremely open nature of the auction meant there were a lot of recurring names, and those included existing ITV franchisees, like Central, who were a part of the Meridian consortium, which meant Michael Green again, or a fifth of him anyway. Technically they were involved in an advisory role, but they were still a full member of the consortium. Meridian bid a total of 36 million. Pretty hefty, especially as an annual fee. But then this ain't a cheap franchise. And TBS knew it. They also knew they'd beat the quality threshold, as pretty much all the incumbents did, pretty much by definition. The viewers liked them, their regional work was on point, and they were behind so much programming for the network that they could reasonably have argued that ITV's Big Five was actually a Big Six while they were around. They probably wouldn't have won that argument, but you'd still have to argue it with them. So the first hurdle was automatically leapt, which meant that to win, they simply had to outbid everyone else. And what with the bids being secret and all, the only way to guarantee that was to bid the absolute most they could possibly afford. Bid high or die was the watchword. So, after careful consideration, they put forth a bid of very nearly £60 million. To repeat once more, these are annual stipends. That's not just a lump sum of £60 million, that's £60 million a year that they were promising to pay for a decade. And those are £1991. In 2025, that would be close to £140 million a year, just as rent, not going towards programme making. And this was a company that was already lying on the ground, bleeding money from every orifice. They were inevitably the highest bidder, because no one else was dumb enough to bid that much for anything. But the ITC still disqualified them on its business plan. Specifically the plan that involved them being able to make or do anything with an annual handicap of 60 million quid. So Meridian won the franchise as the highest qualified bidder, with a 36 million annual stipend, which seemed downright measly by comparison. TBS initially considered legal action, Their business plan, they argued, as in what they'd outlined in writing to the ITC, was perfectly sound and costed, apart from the part where 60 million quid was missing from the annual budget. Their lawyers, however, advised them that legal proceedings also cost money, and their chances of winning were slim to nil. So the company sadly started liquidating itself over the remaining 15 months, before going out with a lot more dignity than their predecessors 11 years earlier.
You've been a wonderful audience, and Meridian are very lucky to have you. So on behalf of everyone here at TVS, goodbye, have a great new year, and thanks for watching. Cheers!
Happy New Year.
Meanwhile, in the north, the auction had created a tangled, bad-tempered web. Except for Border, who won in a walkover, all three companies were involved in all three bids in some way, and there was a potential earth-shattering quake brewing in the northwest. Yorkshire Television faced two bids. Viking TV was quite interesting for being headed by a philosopher king named Hilary Lawson. Known now as a public intellectual and founder of the Institute of Art and Ideas, at that point he was still a young TV producer, former editor of TVAM, and founder of current affairs specialists TVF Productions. His main idea seemed to involve the ITV commissioning process itself, which he argued should only need 20 employees in total. Whatever he actually wanted for television in Yorkshire, it wasn't good enough because Viking failed to clear the quality hurdle. The other contender was White Rose Television, and I haven't been able to find out much solid information on them at all without physically going to York, finding a copy of their application, and probably paying through the nose for it, and I'm not a subsidiary of Fremantle over here. I do know that the consortium was made up of a bunch of local newspapers and Chrysalis, again, hedging their bets, headed by Richard Hanwell of Farnell Electronics, and the money came from the Earl of Dartmouth, then styled Viscount Lewisham, grandson of Barbara Cardland and future UKIP MEP. So there's that. But I'm not sure that White Rose's strategy really hinged on the actual bid itself anyway. They bid 17 million quid, which was nowhere near enough given YTV's extremely high bid of 37 million, which is a lot, even for a Big Five franchise. It's possible they somehow got wind of Viking's plan to bid aggressively themselves, 30 million as it turned out, so it could be argued Yorkshire were being sensible, or at least that they didn't have any other choice. Except that Viking fell at the first hurdle, so the size of their bid was irrelevant, and Yorkshire could have retained the franchise for less than half the annual fee they'd ended up with. Damn. This little bind, and a rumour, which turned out to be true, that the ITC almost failed YTV anyway for overbidding, prompted White Rose not to give up. They'd passed the quality hurdle after all. All they needed was to convince Yorkshire to withdraw anyway, citing the cost that they'd given themselves, and they got the fifth biggest franchise in the network for a relative pittance. So they went to working, offering Yorkshire Television a quarter stake in themselves if they told the ITV they didn't want the licence after all, which would give White Rose the contract by default. A few of Yorkshire's shareholders were actually amenable, given that the prospective annual stipend was more than half the size of Yorkshire's, meaning greater profits. Especially if, having conceded the franchise, they went into a full merger with the smaller company, something White Rose were perfectly open to doing. However, management at YTV were appalled and told White Rose to sod right off. Again, White Rose considered legal action, but found it too expensive for too low a chance of getting anywhere, and that was that for Yorkshire. Meanwhile, the Broadcasting Act had set the rest of the North preying on each other. Tyne's had one challenger, the functionally named North East Television. This was a consortium consisting of the Newcastle Chronicle newspaper, Border and Granada. Tyne's handily outbid them by over £10 million to retain the franchise. Over in Granada land, nerves were raw. No one expected a serious challenger to Granada's might, but thanks to the Broadcasting Act, all it took was someone with deep enough pockets and a basic working knowledge of television, and the oldest company in the network, arguably the cornerstone, would end up walking the Green Mile for nothing. Enter stage left, Phil Redmond. Redmond had become a huge name in British television over the 80s by first creating Grange Hill in 1978, and then with his own company, Mersey Productions, giving rise to Channel 4's very own soap opera Brookside. Pointedly set in Liverpool and filmed in actual Scouse houses. Redmond was and is twice as Scouse as a 50-gallon vat of beef and potato stew, and with an ego roughly the same size and capacity. Now his Mersey television was bidding to take down the game itself. His argument was the same as Merseyvision's in 1980. Granada was too Manchester-centric, what about Liverpool? Except Merseyvision never really thought they could win. Redmond did, and was determined to do so. His company would be known on screen by the very deliberately utilitarian name of North West Television. First time this region will have a television company that reflects the region in name, Redmond said. Local broadcasting, with two capital L's and a capital OC and A in between, was central to Redmond's bid. There would be a daily hour-long regional news programme, something Redmond called timeshare television, where every major settlement in the northwest would get the chance to do something or other. Community access programmes along the lines of the BBC's Open Space, a focus on business and arts, a new soap called Willow Mist aimed at the over 50s, all based at Mersey Television Studios in Campus Manor, Childwall, although Redmond was adamant he wasn't just seeking to replace a bias toward Manchester with one toward Liverpool, no matter how it looked to outsiders. They had the production chops, they had the swagger, they had the commotion, and they had the financial backing, courtesy of Trinity International Holdings, publishers of the Liverpool Echo, investment groups 3i and Causeway Capital, and Yorkshire Television and Tyne's. Now, reports vary on this little circle of predation. It all depends on what happened first. Did Granada go after Tyne's first by investing in North East Television, prompting TTTV to support Redmond, and Yorkshire in turn to support their old Trident partner? Or was it the other way around? Did Yorkshire and Tyne's thumb their noses at Granada first, prompting Granada to give a boost to Tyne's challengers in order to keep them distracted? Whatever the case, it doesn't seem like a good way to build a harmonious network. Or one suspects, however, that harmony wasn't really a consideration post-Broadcasting Act. Granada were rattled, and that rattled British broadcasting in turn. What would happen to Coronation Street? World in Action, Prime Suspect, Coronation Street, Sherlock Holmes, Disappearing World, Coronation Street! It felt like ITV was a Jenga tower and someone was threatening to pull out the foundation stone. Speculation mounted that if the unthinkable happened and Granada lost the franchise, all of those shows and more would end up being sold to other stations. Coronation Street moving to the BBC? Madness! Worse, and frankly more likely, to Sky. Rupert Murdoch undoubtedly rubbed his hands together at the thought of being able to hold the most popular programme in Britain hostage for satellite dishes. It was a terrifying prospect, but it's the kind of thing the Broadcasting Act gave rise to, and its authors probably would have said, no bad thing. More choice, right? Enforced choice still counts. When wallet opening time came, Granada bid $9 million, a reasonable sum for a linchpin of the network, maybe even a touch on the low side. Certainly given that NWT, reaching into the deep pockets of their rich investors, put in a bid of 35 million, blowing Granada out of the water. At least they would have, if the money had come into play at all. But as it turned out, the ITC failed NWT on quality grounds before the envelopes were even opened. Coronation Street was saved. Redmond considered legal action. His ego wouldn't have allowed him not to, but again the chances were too low to justify the expense. For one thing, if the quality hurdle hadn't got him, it's highly likely that NWT would have been disqualified anyway for overbidding. If 9 million was relatively, perhaps even suspiciously modest for such a prestigious franchise, it was at least practical as an annual fee. 35 million wasn't. One way or another, Redmond doomed himself. Whether or not the ITC considered Granada too big and important not to fail any given challenger on quality grounds is, frankly, moot at this point. As for Yorkshire and Tyne Tees, as they had been planning since the Broadcasting Act came in, they re-merged in 1994, something they wouldn't have been able to do if NWT had won. In the southwest, TSW's managing director, Harry Turner, was worried. The rest of the board tended to think otherwise. The franchise wasn't the most attractive, to say the least. It was one of the smallest and least lucrative. But that also made it a soft target for expansionists. It was a potential backway into television, with nothing else a potential investment to build up and sell off in 1994. TSW didn't want to go anywhere though. They liked broadcasting to the southwest, and they were liked by the viewers, not that the viewers mattered. Still, Turner was worried. He'd met with Margaret Thatcher at the Carlton Club towards the end of her premiership, and she told him, "I hope you're not afraid of a little competition." That steeled him to expect the worst. They turned out to face two bids. One was called Teller West, nothing to do with the cable company, and was a proper local concern, largely consisting of former Westwood and TSW employees, including Angela Rippon and, as chairman, Farming Diary producer Mallory Maltby. It was pretty much the definition of a plucky outsider, and didn't really have the resources or experience to provide a serious challenge. The other called itself West Country Television, and was headed by merchant banker Stephen Redfarm. Funding came from Associated Newspapers, again, Brittany Ferries, and the newly privatised South West Water, presumably in need of a friendly propaganda network 2 years after accidentally poisoning the town of Camelford. This bid was dangerous. Redfarm had set his sights on TSW early and had done extensive research and preparation for the bid. They were organised, they had the ideas, they had the cash, and they were coming. Harry Turner felt vindicated, although that didn't help the worry very much. TSW were in a fight, and now everyone knew it. And the biggest worry was cash. West Country had much more than TSW. The quality hurdle was likely to be easy enough vaulted by both companies, so this was ultimately going to go down to the actual bid. Turner and his team estimated the highest West Country could go, and probably would, was 12 million. More in itself than TSW made in a year. But that was the game. They could either concede or roll the dice and hope to figure out something later. They chose the latter and bid a spectacular 16 million. Surely impossible to beat. When the day finally arrived, that turned out to be the case. Teller West fell at the quality hurdle, as was widely expected. West Country turned out to have bid just short of 8 million, less than half what the panicking TSW had bid. But, to Turner's horror, TSW were failed on their business plan, which is to say, they overbid. They were never going to be able to pay 16 million a year. They couldn't even raise that kind of scratch, let alone set it aside as rent. Still, Harry Turner was furious. They'd bid the most and lost, which was the opposite of how this system was supposed to work. As stupid a system as it was, it could at least have played by its own rules. Like Redmond, White Rose and TBS, he considered legal action. Unlike those three, however, he and TSW actually went through with it. Ironically, it was their smallness that prompted them to follow through where the likes of TBS and Mersey Television didn't. Those were big companies. They could survive as independents. Hell, Mersey already was one. The expense of legal proceedings would actually have damaged their prospects in that respect. TSW was a tiny company that barely made anything of saleable interest as it was. They were doomed. They were dead men walking. Frankly, they might as well have taken it to court. They had nothing to lose. So they applied to the High Court for an official judicial review of the proceedings and actually succeeded in getting one, albeit on appeal after being initially turned down. It was historic in one respect. The regulators had never been obligated to explain their franchise decisions all the way back to the ITA days. On those rare occasions when they did, it was strictly voluntary and out of the goodness of their hearts. They'd never been actively forced to do so before. But TSW's appeal meant that the ITC actually had to show their working. All this had a negative effect on West Country's preparations. All this faffing around meant they couldn't set up their operation until the proceedings were over, assuming TSW didn't win. And this ruled out any kind of cooperation between the incumbents and their successors. It may even have contributed to the tragic decision not to keep Gus Honeybun around, although that's pure speculation on my part and I command you not to quote me. After an agonising process of submitting and analysing evidence, the Lords ultimately only took 10 minutes to reach their verdict. No, TSW weren't going to be able to pay 16 million a year without winning the lottery, and since that didn't exist yet, they were definitely doomed. There was the opportunity for further appeals, but the writing was on the wall. Bobtails between their legs, now owing West Country $7,000 for every week's preparation they'd missed out on, TSW prepared for the end. The grand finale went out at 6 p.m. as the final episode of the news programme TSW Today. Old announcers returned for one last time. Gus Honeybun was returned to the wild. The mass pipes and drums of the city of Plymouth played an endless version of Auld Lang Syne, as if trying to extend the franchise period by stealth. By Easter of 1993, the remains of TSW were sold to a company that made army boots.
Hello, good morning and welcome.
TVAM was supposed to be Newsnight with Cornflakes, a television adaptation of Radio 4's Today programme. Unfortunately, no one actually wanted to watch that at 6 in the morning, even if it had actually been competently done, which as it turned out it wasn't. So it collapsed inside a month and slowly regenerated into a very different, lower brow service with the same name and much of the same aesthetic, but ultimately an almost completely separate operation. By the dawn of the 90s, under the iron fist of Australian television despot Bruce Gyngell, it was the UK's breakfast television of choice and one of the most profitable stations in the world. And a favourite of Margaret Thatcher, of course, for whom it, and Gyngell in particular, represented her neoliberal vision perfectly. Of course, it was going to attract its fair share of challengers. The breakfast franchise was a particularly tasty plum in the pie, if far from the cheapest. There were two competitors in the end. One was called Daybreak Television, no relation to the Chris Chataway-led consortium that bid for the original licence in 1980, and was headed by Mike Hollingsworth, former head of programmes at TVAM until Gingell sacked him. He cheerfully admitted his bid was largely motivated by resentment, and also included several other alumni of both TVAM and Breakfast Time. ITN were also part of the coalition, providing the facilities and, of course, the news. Investors included the Daily Telegraph, NBC Europe, Mills and Allen again, Carlton again, and Taylor Woodrow Construction. The other bid was from Sunrise Television, and was another pet project for a TVAM veteran who'd been unceremoniously sacked by Gingell. In his case, for nothing so much as saving the station. It was, of course, Greg Dyke, now managing director of LWT, which is why they were one of the main movers behind the bid. They also roped in Scottish Television alongside The Guardian, and, perhaps most impressive of all, the Walt Disney Company. This was before they owned everything, of course, but it was also the year of Beauty and the Beast, which really marked the Disney Renaissance as a thing, and not just one freak good movie in 1989. So it was a good time to get on the mouse's good side. In terms of programming plans, neither Daybreak nor Sunrise really outlined anything particularly different to what TVAM were doing, but then that was succeeding wildly. Sunrise, however, did have one major innovation in their bid: £3.4 million invested in regional opt-outs, local news, weather and travel for each of the ITV regions. It was something TVAM had never done. It never seemed to occur to them. It wasn't mentioned by Daybreak either. So TVAM had formidable opposition, as they expected. In response, TVAM dropped a frankly bizarre bid centring around the notion that they would establish a £10 million fund for programmes of especially high quality, mostly bought in from independents. Those programmes would have titles like Through the Eyes of Children, Displaced People, and Family of Europe. There would be something called Speaker's Corner, where they would rent space in regional studios for viewers to rant about things they didn't understand, which just sounds like the time and the place to me. There would be a strand known as Educational Minutes, which would use experimental broadcasting techniques, which could mean anything. There would be a half-hour drama series for young people produced by Mersey Television, or possibly NWT, depending on how that shook out, although it's highly unlikely that Phil Redmond knew about it at the time either way. It was highbrow, it was aspirational, it was disturbingly reminiscent of Peter J, and it was obviously never going to work. Even if they got any of this stuff on screen, no one would have watched it, and it would have been straight back to Lorraine Kelly reading out the bingo numbers in 6 weeks flat. But of course it didn't necessarily matter. What mattered was cold, hard cash. All three bids passed the quality threshold, so it was entirely down to whose bank account had the largest, roundest balls. And through the franchise summer, rumours had abounded that Gingell had bid far, far too low. Some people couldn't credit it. That was a basic tactical error that seemed beyond the man who, as he told it, practically invented Australian television. In the end, it was close. Daybreak bid 33 million. Sunrise, 34.5. So Greg Dyke's Disney-centred coalition won by a nose. Meanwhile, TVAM were nowhere. They bid 14.13 million. They were blown out of the water and into a nearby bed and breakfast only 15 minutes walk from the beach. Gingell, by all accounts, very nearly keeled over in shock. A few hours later he got a phone call from Mrs. Thatcher to commiserate, followed by a letter which Gingell read out in a press conference. It was the first and only time she ever apologised for one of her policies, because it was one of the only times one of them actually bit her personally. By the time Sunrise went on screen, it had the clunkier name of GMTV, due to threatened legal action from Sky, as Rupert Murdoch actually owned the entire Sky and everything in it. It got off to almost as bad a start as TVAM, which probably cheered Gingell up.
for the very latest news, for the recipe of the day, for the very latest holiday information, page the Oracle.
There was one new franchise created for the 1991 auction, but that hadn't been the plan. ITV's teletext service, Oracle, had been running since 1978. By 1990 it had about 6 million people viewing it on the regular and was regarded as a useful, lighter-hearted alternative to the BBC's CFAX. But the government didn't seem to know, or care. The Broadcasting Act, when still a bill, listed the 12 transmission lines on which Oracle operated as spare capacity, and planned to sell them all off for pennies, blithely unaware or uncaring about the very concept of teletext. Oracle and its staff were understandably horrified at not only losing their jobs, but having those jobs essentially unhappened, and began an extensive campaign to the ITC and the government to have those 12 lines protected and a franchise established for an ongoing ITV and Channel 4 teletext service using them. After much badgering and letter writing, both from Oracle themselves and its viewers, they finally won. ITV and Channel 4 teletext was officially the 17th franchise, and the last to be awarded in April of 1992. There was a surprising amount of interest as well. Carlton were there, of course, backing up Intelfax, who already made Foretel for Channel 4. TVAM, of all people, put in a bid in a desperate attempt to keep the company alive, and Associated Newspapers, again, were behind the imaginatively named Teletext Limited. In the end, Oracle's bid of 6.7 million was defeated by Teletext Limited's 8.2, and having sweated blood to create a franchise at all, Oracle lost it for want of £1.5 million. They went out dramatically like Southern, but without any obvious signs of bitterness. The new service generally felt colder and more corporate than Oracle, matching its generic name. But they did bring us Bamboozled and Digitizer, although, come on, Oracle would have hired Mr. Biffo too. And a fast-text multiple-choice quiz isn't exactly something that requires a one-of-a-kind genius to think it up. On the 6th of March 1988, 3 IRA members who were planning a car bombing were shot dead by the SAS in Gibraltar in what was described as a shootout. 6 weeks later, an investigation by the current affairs show This Week, produced by Thames Television, revealed that the 3 were unarmed and surrendering when they were shot. There was immediate uproar at the programme and at Thames for making it. They were accused of subjecting the SAS to trial by TV. The programme's editor, Roger Bolton, was labelled a terrorist collaborator by the Daily Mail, over which he later successfully sued them for libel. The programme's main eyewitness was called a lying whore in the national press. Thames eventually agreed to an independent inquiry, which saw no wrongdoing and indeed actively praised the programme. Margaret Thatcher utterly rejected their findings. The Broadcasting Act, which had been introduced as a bill some 6 months after broadcast, went into effect shortly afterwards. All of this may or may not have some bearing on what happened in 1991. Or it could just be a coincidence. A happy one for Thatcher, a miserable one for anyone who appreciated British television. London was still the jewel in the crown. 2 jewels. 2 shiny, shiny jewels. LWT were the ones that seemed in the most trouble initially. A consortium calling itself London Independent Broadcasting stomped into the field. Almost the same name as Hughie Green's bid in 1980, but this was much more formidable. a coalition between Polygram, Mentorn, Palace Pictures and Working Title Films, all big fish in their respective ponds, even if Palace Pictures was on the verge of collapse. They were going to make their own news and bring in international dramas from Polygram's Propaganda Pictures subsidiary, and it was going to be great. Unfortunately for them, they were also a disorganised mess, summed up by the urban legend that on the night before they were due to put in their bid, the poor sod typing it all up at the last minute accidentally unplugged the computer before saving it, and had to do it all again. And then they accidentally missed a page out and had to hunt for a stapler. Unsurprisingly, but much to LWT's delight and frankly relief, they fell at the quality hurdle, despite bidding a humongous $35.5 million, leaving LWT to retain the contract on a relatively measly $7.5 million. And then there was London Weekdays. This was Michael Green's Everest. This was the one he really wanted. His Carlton Communications was sniffing around plenty of options in this auction, as investors in Daybreak and Aslam Cells bidding for the South East region, but that was a mere dalliance. This was the target. He had tried to buy it outright in the 80s, only to be told no by the then IBA, so he invested in Central instead. Now, the IBA were gone, and he was still here. Green was known to be a personal friend of Margaret Thatcher, and rumour has it that after the IBA blocked his takeover of Thames, he squealed directly to her. She was certainly not going to accept this kind of interference in the sacred free market. Even apartheid wasn't a good enough reason to interfere in the market as far as she was concerned. So it's hard not to join the dots, assuming Green really did talk to Thatcher about it, which does seem likely, and assign Green a chunk of blame for the Broadcasting Act 1990. And this was all a couple of years before Death on the Rock as well. Of course, there was another contender, Frost and Branson's CPV TV, and as it turned out, they were the highest bidder, or would have been if they'd not fallen at the quality hurdle, at $45 million. It was the only one of their three bids that they would have won, and narrowly at that, because the second highest bid was $43 million, and that was Carlton. The company behind Minder, Callan, Rumpole, The Sweeney, Mad About the House, Robin's Nest, George and Mildred, Rainbow, Danger Mouse, Duckula, everything else Cosgrove Hall did on ITV, Kenny Everett's best television work, Love in a Cold Climate, Hazel, Marmalade Atkins, The Tomorrow People, Bless This House, The Bill, Armchair Theatre, Thriller and Cinema, The Naked Civil Servant, Rock Folly, Selling Hitler, Prospects, The Nation's Health, Monsignor Quixote, Riley Ace of Spies, Danger UXB, The Best of Tommy Cooper, Mr. Bean, Quatermass Conclusion, Edward and Mrs. Simpson, The World at War, and Miracles Take Longer, had been deposed by some upstarts created for the sole purpose of winning an ITV franchise, and who, per their own bid, weren't even going to make their own programming for the most part, but act as a publisher broadcaster, commissioning shows from indies. Possibly including Thames, because that's what they were now. It was the ultimate victory of capital over art. Thames bowed out with grace on December the 31st, 1992. It was the end of ITV as we knew it. The following decade was a mess of franchises being bought out until no one really knew who owned what or where they were. By the time the contracts were up for renewal again, all but four of the franchises were owned by the same company, ITV plc, and franchise rounds were irrelevant. Two of those four were subsequently absorbed as well. It was essentially the triumph of one company, Granada. It turns out that ITV was a race all along, and Granada won. In fact, as effectively the only company never to lose their franchise in any way, they were the only ones to actually run the whole course from start to finish, and are still running now. Carlton were remarkably efficient and ruthless at ruining ITV in their own way, being as they were a company created solely to use the television industry to make money, with only a perfunctory attitude at best towards the actual medium. But they weren't the ones who catamaried the most franchises once the floodgates were opened. Carlton took over Central, which they already owned a fifth of, and West Country, plus HTV, but only because Granada had finally hit the limit and weren't permitted to keep it. Granada had already absorbed Yorkshire Tyne Tees, LWT, Anglia and Meridian, and would add Border in 2001 when no one cared anymore. Anglia and Meridian, and technically HTV, came from the forgotten third side in the 90s ITV gold rush, United Media. By the late 90s it was explicitly a race between them and Carlton to see who got to merge with Granada. After an attempt to merge themselves together for that purpose collapsed, Granada ate United and Carlton got the honour. And even then Carlton was so dwarfed that it was a merger almost in name only. The new ITV plc was 2/3 Granada and 1/3 Carlton. It was basically the last major takeover. The accountants just acted like Granada had simply changed its name. ITV, as we know it now, is basically Granada, a continuation of the old company set up in 1955 that started broadcasting in 1956. That's except for viewers in Scotland who have their own third channel, but probably not for much longer. STV has been struggling financially for a while. Just in the past couple of weeks it's essentially ended the legacy of Grampian by announcing the closure of the Aberdeen studios to save money. It will probably be part of ITV plc by the 30s. Is ITV really that much worse now, in the plc era, than before the Broadcasting Act when it was a federation? It's hard not to come to the conclusion that it is. That ITV, or rather the multiple companies that worked for the broadcaster, the IBA, used to make quality television much more regularly than the PLC does now. Make no mistake, they do still make good television, but that doesn't seem to be the goal in itself anymore. Well, let's face it, it isn't. And when they do, when things like Broadchurch, Douglas is cancelled and Mr. Bates versus the Post Office come along, they stand out a lot more amongst all the smush than they used to when the likes of Thames, Central, Yorkshire and yes, Granada were competing with each other for network space. Now that is an example of competition helping to improve content. But more than that, it was a different philosophy. It was a time when content actually mattered, certainly more than it does now. I'm not saying populism wasn't a thing, of course it was. There is always a bottom line and there is always a lowest common denominator to feed. LWT is a great example of that. It was originally founded on trying to disprove that premise completely, and it failed so hard it did the exact opposite. Only by embracing the lowest common denominator and the bottom line as a particularly passionate lover could LWT survive. But they still made Upstairs, Downstairs and The Gentle Touch, as well as On the Buses and Game for a Laugh. These days the philosophy seems to be that content is a means to an end, the end being money. A bit like that famous Michael Eisner quote, only far more dead-eyed and shark-like. And sure enough, ITV made record profits in 2024. And it's not as if anything else matters. This has been a Bob the Fish production, one of dozens you can watch right now for free on bobthefish.org.uk. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell, and join us on patreon.com/applemask to support further productions and gain fabulous exclusive content, like my ongoing history of the BBC, your day's viewing on a random day in history, even a few exclusive mini video essays. Plus the satisfaction of knowing that thanks to you, I get to eat regular meals. bobthefish.org.uk. We care because you do.